So, we're going to talk about getting started with Scrum projects and some of the artifacts around it. So, let me start the slides here. And first, I just want to go over some common Scrum terms. We're going to be talking about most of these during the lecture, but wanted to kind of go over them. And first, starting with the product backlog. This is a very important part of any Scrum project. And what a backlog is a list of all of the known requests that the product owner has for the project team. It can be things that are very important to when we have a chance to get to it, great, and really everything in between. This will set the foundation of what we're going to work on, and as a team, work together on how we prioritize what's in the product backlog to be working on at any given time. Because not everything in the product backlog is worked on at the same time. And as a matter of fact, there may be things that are in the product backlog that never get done. There are also potentially and likely additional items that the product owner would like added that will be added throughout the course of the different stages or the sprints of a project that don't exist today, that may come in a week from now, that may come in 6 weeks from now. This is a very dynamic list, and based off of kind of the need and the importance to the business, the product owner will work with the team at every stage of a sprint, every iteration, and add and remove items that they want to be part of the next set of work that's done by the project team. Now, within the product backlog, we have what are known as user stories. I do have the word epic here. You will hear that term. What an epic essentially is a user story that is too big to be done in any one given iteration or sprint for a project team. And once again, we're going to get into more of this in just a bit. So, for our purposes and for our classes, we're going to be talked about user stories. And these are essentially business ways of saying what needs to be done. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of the criteria and what goes into user stories. But essentially, a backlog is made up of user stories that we need to prioritize and put some estimation of effort to before we can actually start working on it. To estimate, we use story points. And story points is a way to assign a value to a user story that allows us to understand the degree of work we have to do to complete that user story in relation to everything else that we have. And we'll talk about that. And one of the things I'll even mention now is teams tend to fall into estimating user stories by how many hours that it will take to complete. That is not recommended in Scrum. We actually want to use something that's not more of an actual numeric measurement, but we want to use it more numbers as a comparison in total effort that something would take. So, example, if you have a value of 1 on one user story and a value of 2 on another, that second one should take about twice as long to do as the one that you assigned 1. It's more proportionality than hours or days or some other type of metrics that you might be used to using for estimations. All of these things come into what is sprints, and we're going to get into sprints a little bit more, but a sprint is essentially what is used to time box a project in the amount of work that will be given done in a certain period of time. Typically, sprints are 1 to 4 weeks. 2 to 3 weeks is very common, and actually the most common that I've used in my career. That during that 2 to 3 week period, we agree on how many user stories we can complete, and then at the end of that sprint, we actually deliver those user stories to the business. And the theory behind Scrum is one, at the end of those sprints, at the end of 2 or 3 weeks, the business is getting value, something they and theoretically can use that will help them with some aspect of the organization to move them forward. It's not like waterfall where it can take weeks or months or even sometimes years before something is delivered to the business that actually provides value. The second thing that a sprint does is they're very iterative in nature, and I've used that word a lot, where you can change your mind on what's important. You can change your mind on what you want to focus on. You don't need everything understood and clear day one. All you need to know is what's going to go in that next sprint and prioritize that work and focus on it. And then at the end of 2, 3, 4 weeks, you re engage with the product team to decide what's next and what's important. And during that time, you're understanding what's going in the sprint backlog and what goes part of the sprint planning that you're actually looking to accomplish. So, once again, we'll get into more of these details as we go through the slides. Here's an overview of the Scrum framework. And we talked about the product backlog, the ranking of what is required, features, enhancements, bug fixes that are made up of user stories. Then we go in and the team will decide on kind of what is going to make it into that first sprint. We'll go through an exercise to do that today through these lectures. But that is a team effort and understanding what, as a team, we think should go into the next sprint, which becomes part of the sprint backlog. And those first three boxes there are what we're going to focus on this week. We'll get into the sprint iterations, the daily scrums, the sprint reviews, the burn down charts. Those things we'll get into next week. So we're only going to focus on the product backlog through the sprint backlog today. Let's get into some details. Product backlog, and I went over that a bit just a few minutes ago, but I've listed several key characteristics of this. And some of the key ones is that it's dynamic. This is a living document for the project team to view new requirements, to change priorities, but ultimately the product owner is responsible for this document and keeping this document up to date. In that, there's typically user stories, but other things that some organizations don't consider user stories, such as bug fixes or technical works, or even gaining knowledge. We need to find out more about something. So that knowledge acquisition can go in as part of a backlog that needs to be done as part of the work brought into the script. We're going to get into estimates in a little bit and how we go about that. Transparency. Everyone in the organization should be able to see this. Um, Typically, stakeholders and others that we talked about in part of Waterfall are main part of the project. But for transparency, really everybody in the organization, you can see what's a priority and what's being worked on right now. And we can change this. We have the ability to refine this, and we can look to review, add, remove, alter our thoughts on something that we had before. So as long as we're not actively working on it in the sprint, there's no guarantee where it sits in the backlog today will be where it sits a month from now. And then ultimately, the product backlog should look to contribute towards achieving an overall goal and satisfying stakeholder requirements, quickly getting things done and delivering to the business. Now, those user stories. A user story is a short, simple sentence or two to describe from a perspective of a person who needs the new capability, to needs to be able to do something, what how they would describe it. And the format is typically written as a whatever type of user, I want to do something so that it will give me this. And we'll show you some examples of these sentences. But these are typically English statements saying who you are, what you want, and why you want it. And then based off of those, we can look to use those stories to focus the work to find the needs of the real users, the people who actually will gain the benefit and the value from them. Now, we don't want to make these too big. That's where the difference between the epics and the user stories. If they are too big to be completed in one sprint, or there's some complexity that doesn't allow us really to feel comfortable that we can do it in that sprint, that 1 to 4 week period, those are typically referred to as epics. And we'll want to look to break them down and really get it to a much more smaller level of granularity so that we are able to fit them into user stories. And then each story comes with an acceptance criteria, i.e., how are we going to test this to determine when it's actually completed. And then during the sprints, these user stories are worked on in a collaborative manner with everybody potentially on the sprint team working or verifying or possibly doing something with this and working with the product owner and the stakeholders to make sure that that initial definition of the user story is being completed and is actually delivering the value that was intended when the story was created. So story points. This is where the team gets involved with the Scrum project probably early and the earliest and most often. But based off of the definition of the story, an understanding of the effort, complexity, and risk, we're looking to do estimates of how long it would take. And unlike time estimates, points reflect the relative size of the story in comparison to other stories. And as you do more of these projects and as teams work together and as you start working with the product owner, these estimates are going to become better and better and better. And we don't want one person giving the estimates. We want the team as a whole to be able to understand what's going on and collectively as a team give feedback on their experience and their capabilities and what they think it needs to actually get done. And when thinking about this, teams need to consider, as I mentioned, a number of different factors. But at the end, we need to go to a consensus on how many points we need to assign to this particular user story. Now, you don't want to get bogged down in this. You don't want to spend a half hour, an hour on every user story arguing, debating, discussing. It does have to be a rather quick process. Yes, you want to sit and talk about it. Yes, you want to ask a few questions. But at some point, you need to get a consensus what the room is, move forward. If you're wrong, adjust, call it out, but you have to move forward in a rather consistent and quick manner. This can't be paralysis of doing stories that just bog the entire team down. Okay. Many teams work on story points in a variety of different ways, and each organization will have their own. I'm looking to do something such as a Fibonacci sequence, and you see that here. I think I have a video talking about that, but it's a set of numbers. I don't think we have to go past 13. If you see a need to, feel free, but look for those numbers and kind of assign one of those numbers. One being the easiest and most straightforward, with 13 being the most time consuming, the most complex, the most difficult to understand as you go through the assignment this week and try to understand how you would assign points to the given story. And then ultimately, by abstracting away the hours and focusing on value and complexity, story points can help prioritize work that delivers the most value to the users efficiently. Once again, getting value, getting product, getting something to the users quickly in a short time frame that continues to improve whatever kind of project and goals that those teams have set out for you, and thus the reason the project team has even been put together in the first place. I'm going to come back. I'm going to stop this video and then I'm going to walk you through a sample backlog project. Hopefully, it kind of relates to what we're going to be doing for our assignment 3 and give you a little bit better idea of what I'm looking for that assignment. And I'll be back with a second video.